In the middle of a pandemic, when the global economy is suffering and U.S.-China relations have cratered,
Kung flu should have been stopped at the source, which was China.
There is no international law that supports blaming a country for simply being the first to report a disease.
Apple opened a new store in Beijing to replace its first ever store in China, built back in 2008 ahead of the Beijing Olympics. Construction on this started long before the coronavirus, and for the opening, there were strict measures because of it. Social distancing in the lineups, everyone wearing masks. There were temperature checks and hand sanitizer, and limits on how many people were allowed inside. China is a crucial market for Apple and other American tech companies, with hundreds of millions of potential customers and big Chinese competitors like Huawei.
I would not think about is American's product or Chinese product. I just want it because of it's good.
Winning over the market here is a challenge to begin with. The pandemic doesn't help, but politics could complicate the landscape even more.
This is a strange time for American companies doing business in China, with relations between the two countries deteriorating to the point of people talking about a new Cold War. Tech companies like Apple in particular really rely on China's supply chain to make all of this.
U.S. tech companies are facing a lot of scrutiny from Washington over their ties to China. The U.S. Attorney General, William Barr, recently tore into Apple and Alphabet's Google, as well as Microsoft and other tech firms that do business in China.
America's big tech companies have also allowed themselves to become pawns of Chinese influence.
Then he took some swings at Hollywood, too, claiming companies agree to Chinese censorship of movies.
This censorship infects not only the versions of movies that are released in China, but also many that are shown in the United States theaters to American audiences.
It's the latest in a series of moves and speeches by the Trump administration warning about China. And Beijing has been keeping pace with its own share of sanctions and threats. Last week alone, Beijing sanctioned U.S. officials, including 2 Republican senators, for sanctions on Chinese officials over Xinjiang.
On Monday, for the first time, we made our policy on the South China Sea crystal clear. It's not China's maritime empire.
When the U.S. criticized China's moves in the South China Sea, China sanctioned Lockheed Martin for selling weapons to Taiwan.
Today I signed legislation and an executive order to hold China accountable for its oppressive actions against the people of Hong Kong.
And as President Trump ended Hong Kong's special economic status, the State Department slapped visa restrictions on employees of Chinese tech companies, including Huawei. And there's talk of possibly banning all Chinese Communist Party members and their families from visiting the U.S. That's roughly 270 million people. So it's no surprise the consensus among experts is that U.S.-China relations are scraping a new low. For Apple, there are other headwinds, too. It's been criticized for removing apps and, more recently, for freezing updates on thousands of mobile games on the China App Store after government pressure to comply with local rules. None of it seems to faze people here.
If the government don't stop Apple from exporting anything to China, I don't think it will stop me.
Some waited for hours to be among the first to see the new store, pandemic and politics aside.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.